It does make sense that if we do know for a fact, and we do, that the sea level rose dramatically at the end of the Ice Age, it makes sense that some things would be buried under the water.
Well, and during the Ice Age, whatever, you don't have to talk about advanced civilizations or anything, but during the Ice Age, living on the coastlines and establishing your villages, communities, and everything on the coastlines would have been probably one of the most benign places to get, because for one thing, you're down near sea. The sea level, the presence of the seas is going to, smooth out the climate and so forth. So, you're going to have probably most cultural development during the Ice Age is going to be close to the sea. So it's going to be underwater now, just like Graham was talking about. And so this, to me, is probably the future of archaeology, is marine archaeology, where a lot of discoveries are going to be made. And in that particular thing, I mean, there's a lot of megalithic structures around the world that if you set that thing up like this and put those sighting holes through it, would look precisely like, scrape the barnacles off of it, and no one's saying, oh, it's proven. But what it is we have to keep an open mind and say, well, there are some very strong similarities here, so let's investigate this thing further. And that's the whole point of all this, is all of this stuff needs more research. It doesn't need some cavalier dismissal by somebody who's, protecting their own paradigm. It needs more research on all fronts. I mean, because I think that there's enough evidence that is now accumulated to suggest that there is a deep history to the human species on Earth. And we're just beginning to really appreciate how much deeper it really is than the conventional models of history. And rather than just waving an arm and dismissing this,
with a skeptical sneer.
With a skeptical sneer, exactly.
Well, what's interesting is that there is accepted scientific models of humanity when you're talking about supervolcanoes, right? Like the supervolcano of 60, 70,000 years ago.
Mount Toba.
Yeah, I mean, they pretty much accept that wiped out the vast majority of human beings on Earth. And why is the supervolcano hypothesis so easily accepted, but yet the asteroidal impact, I mean, both of them are real events, both of them are historically documented. In fact, we've never watched a supervolcano take over the world, but we've seen asteroids hit other planets. We've actually watched Shoemaker-Levy, like you were talking about before.
Bombarding Jupiter, unbelievable
bigger
event.
impact than the planet Earth itself.
Yeah, exactly.
Boom.
So, yeah, and actually more than 20 impacts. Each one of them would have wiped out all life on Earth if that object had hit the Earth. Yeah, so it's a very another thing we were talking about underwater structures, but let's also consider the possibility, and again, John Anthony West's work is important here. Let's also consider the possibility that we have misidentified a number of structures that are standing in plain view, like the Great Sphinx. Egyptology, read any Egyptological text, any encyclopedia actually, they will tell you that thing was put there by a specific pharaoh Khafre of the 4th dynasty, around about 2500 BC. That is not a fact. That is an opinion. But it's presented as a fact. There is not a single inscription that relates the Sphinx to that pharaoh, not a contemporary inscription, not one dating from 2500 BC. In fact, there's nothing at all. It's just the assumption, because it's close to a pyramid, which they assume the same pharaoh built, again on the absence of evidence, that the Sphinx must have been built by them. But John Anthony West was the first to see that actually when we look at the Sphinx, we're looking at a highly eroded stone object. And that erosion is very odd, and that's why he brought Professor Robert Schoch, professor of geology from Boston University, to Giza in 1992 to look at the Sphinx and say, what actually caused this weathering on the Sphinx? And Schoch immediately saw it. What caused it was exposure to a very long period of heavy rainfall. And no such rains have fallen in Egypt in the last 5,000 years, but they did fall during the Younger Dryas. We had a prolonged rainout from this comet impact as that ice cap was pulverized and a massive amount of ice water was thrown up into the upper atmosphere. A prolonged rainout, which could have been the cause of the erosion on the Sphinx.
Now, what has occurred new? What discoveries have been discovered in the last year? Like what is new that we can look at?
In terms of archaeology, there's not much new. Göbekli Tepe at the moment is in deep freeze. It's right 30 miles from the Syrian border. There's been massive unrest in Şanlıurfa, which is the main town. Archaeology is very difficult for them to carry on there. It's basically just frozen.
So they just sort of stopped.
They've just kind of stopped, And in fact, there's an amazing number of these sites. Another site I visited for
I might play a different game soon.
Lebanon. Absolutely stunning site. And again, I'm convinced that site is nuanced. It is, yes, there is a Roman temple there, but they put that temple there because the site was sacred long before, and there's this incredible U-shaped megalithic wall which surrounds Baalbek, which does not appear to have any connection to the Roman structure at all. Again, that's an area which is subject to tremendous unrest and difficulty, and it's difficult for archaeologists to proceed. But just in 2014, they made a huge new discovery at Baalbek of a buried block which weighs 1,460 tons, which was sitting there on the site. They've been working that site for 100 years. They only found it in 2014.
Wow, 1,000 tons.
1,460 tons.
Is that 2 million pounds? Is that what that is?
I don't know. Maybe Randall's math is better than mine in converting it into pounds.
1 ton
times 2,000 pounds.
Yeah.
2,000 pounds to a ton, to an imperial ton. So whatever, add 3 zeros on it, double it and add 3 zeros on it.
It's a horrendous amount of pounds, put it that way. It's the single largest block of stone ever cut and quarried in the ancient world.
And they found this
Sailor Curse, I'm really sorry, dude.
Now there's another big one right beside it, which has been in plain view for about the last 100 years.
You're driving the Sentra, right? The 2011 Sentra, not to dox you.
Covered by sediment.
You have an actual calculator? You might
be
the
only person
left.
I never go anywhere without my calculator.
You have a real calculator. Nobody has one of those. We were just talking about that yesterday. You're like, who the fuck buys calculators?
It's not an iPhone, it's an actual calculator.
I'm the last guy on Earth to carry one of them.
Wow. So Baalbek was also the site of, there's many monoliths that have been discovered there, and it's a really fascinating site that many people have sort of overlooked when you talk about ancient structures from the past.
Absolutely. I have to resist. I've got nothing against aliens, but I don't need aliens to explain these things. I think a much leaner and more elegant explanation for these huge archaeological anomalies is a lost human civilization.
Much better.
Yeah. That's been the case that I've been making for 25 years.
Why?
I think the alien thing is a bit of a distraction. Of course there's aliens. Of course the universe is full of life. But the ancient archaeological sites are not good evidence for that idea. They're very, unless you massage the evidence a lot, they're not good evidence. So I think we are dealing with a lost human civilization. And at Baalbek, 20 feet above the ground, we have 3 blocks of stone joined so closely together that you can't get an edge of a sheet of paper between them. Each one weighs more than 900 tons, and they are 20 feet above the ground. It's a stunning achievement. It's just absolutely astonishing. How on earth did they do that?
And how does mainstream archaeology deal with that?
Wow, no. Look how far apart those things are.
The Romans did do some awesome stuff.
They did do some awesome stuff. They absolutely did. But this site is separate from the Roman site. It surrounds it, but it's not part of it, in my view.
I like how me thinking that me just saying no will change the outcome of the game.
Or certainly right up there would be the comet research.
Argue with
and the discovery. I mean, like this article I have right here, which came out in 2014, so it's not that old. A nano diamond rich layer across 3 continents, consistent with major cosmic impact at 12,800 years ago. And it's something like 24,
what was that
25
sidestep, man?
highly pedigreed scientists.
And these are the Comet Research Group. These are the scientists from the Comet Research Group who have funded all their research themselves. They came out with another paper in 2015.
Where was this published, if anybody wants to read this?
That's in the Journal of Geology.
I have to get it.
But then there's the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, host a lot of their work as well. And the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences get into trouble for hosting their work, but they feel it's important, so they keep on hosting it.
This is so spectacularly confusing to me, because that's rock solid science.
Yeah.
I mean, this is evidence. This is actually, you can weigh this stuff. You can measure it. You could run tests on it and find out what its components are. This to me is so baffling.
Yeah, it's very baffling. They brought out another paper in 2015. I won't go into some of the details are boring, but it's called a Bayesian chronological analysis. And basically what they were looking at, they asked themselves, is it possible that this evidence, these nanodiamonds, these melt glass, the carbon spherules, could that have been laid down gradually? And the chronological analysis that they've done absolutely answers that. No, it was not laid down gradually. This whole thing unfolded in a period of about 24 hours.
Whoa. What a night.
Yeah, and what had happened, Joe, was that for years, archaeologists had recognized this black mat layer at about 24 or more of the Clovis sites around North America, which there had been over 50 of them that have been studied. And it was C. Vance Haynes who wrote an interesting paper saying that he was the one who noted that below this black mat layer, which is only 2 to 3 inches thick in most sites, you found evidence of the Clovis culture. You found their tool kits and their spear points and so on. You found evidence of the extinct megafauna, but not above it. You would find this evidence of this cultural activity and the megafauna right up to the bottom of the black mat layer, but not above it. So what finally happened was in 2007, Richard Firestone and Alan West and some of their colleagues, and it was just basically a small group at that point, took a look at this closer look, and that's when they began to discover these impact proxies, usually right at the base of the layer. And the layer itself is carbonaceous, which suggests that there had been a lot of soot deposited, which would imply widespread wildfires. In fact, there's a study right off the coast of California here on the Santa Rosa Islands that pretty much concluded that there was just massive wildfires that pretty much just annihilated everything. And then this was preceded by the deposition of this black mat layer. And right at the bottom of this black mat layer is where you find the nanodiamonds, the magnetic grains, the microspherules, the carbonaceous spherules, fullerenes. You find these impact proxies, and they're not all the same at all the sites. In fact, that's been one of the things that the critics have seized upon. But what they're doing is, I think, taking an oversimplified model. And when you look at a comet fragmentation event, you could be looking at the individual pieces have very different compositions. And what we were talking about earlier, the Taurid meteor stream, I'm not convinced at this point that it was necessarily just a single impact event. It may have been a bombardment episode that may have lasted even several decades. It may have then ceased for a while. And we were talking about this last night over dinner, that there seems to be a second spasm at 11,600 years ago that's also associated with a massive rise in sea level. They call, there's two meltwater spikes, meltwater spike 1A and meltwater spike 1B. I'm quite convinced that these meltwater spikes that have been documented by marine geologists and oceanographers are correlated with these melting events of the ice sheet that I've been looking at in terms of their geomorphic consequences. Because some of these events, I mean, the only way I can describe some of these meltwater events is that the only modern analog to this would be a tsunami. And we've seen some pretty devastating tsunamis within the last decade or two.
I wonder if this is going to work.
In Indonesia and in Japan. And I don't know if you've ever seen any of the videos of these tsunamis.
Can you imagine?
Anybody listening, it is definitely worthwhile to go online and look at some of these videos where you can actually see the unbelievably powerful effects of a 30 or 40 or 50 foot tsunami, right? Now, some of the landscapes, and I have some images we can pull up here shortly, are places in Montana, Idaho, Washington, where you literally had a tsunami sweeping over the land that was over 1,000 feet deep.
And that tsunami came off the ice cap. That's not an oceanic tsunami. That's
that extra boost I need. It's so dumb. That extra boost is so fucking dumb.
This catastrophic melting.
Whatever, I would have passed away anyways.
And I've traced the sources of some of these meltwater. I've made 2 trips now up into the plateau country of British Columbia, looking for the source of this meltwater, because in the conventional models now of this flooding, that goes back to Harlan Bretz, and basically what they've done is they said initially there could have been no flood because Harlan Bretz didn't provide a source for the water. The critics said, well, you're saying that all of this evidence in the landscape is evidence of the flood, but what was the source of the flood? And he didn't have a source. So the critics then said, well, you don't have a source for the flood water, therefore the flood didn't take place. Then as the research evolved, you had independent evidence accumulating in western Montana by J.T. Pardee, who was with the U.S. Geological Survey. And he was investigating evidence that the mountain valleys of western Montana had been filled up with an enormous volume of water. And this volume of water seemed to be exactly the same time as Bretz's floods.
I hate this fucking game.
He then assumed that this was a giant lake, and because you can see, and we can, I think we have some images, I think Jamie has some images, so we'll pull them up shortly. We're on the mountainside, you see the shorelines etched, 1,000 feet above the valley floor. And what he then decided was that based upon an old 19th century interpretation by T.C. Chamberlain, that there had been an ice dam, he said, well, there must have been an ice dam west of here somewhere in the Clark Fork Valley. A giant lake backed up, burst through the ice dam, and then this is what would have caused Harlan Bretz's floods. So now the geological community is shifting because, number one, the evidence is overwhelming and they can't deny it anymore. But what they're doing is looking for a gradualist or a more uniformitarian explanation. So they immediately latched onto this, well, there was a giant pro-glacial or in front of a glacial lake in western Montana. Well, you're talking about somewhere between 520 and 550 cubic miles of water. That's a lot of water, right? Normally, when you have a large lake, you have a huge catchment basin that is feeding lots of streams and rivers that are feeding into that lake. When you look at any of the big lakes around North America, you have the lake, and then you have this big old catchment basin, and all of that's feeding in. In Lake Missoula, the whole lake fills almost the whole catchment basin. It's like, to me, what they did was they said, okay, we're just going to push the source of the water from here over to here, but let's not go into the question of where did the water come from that's filling these mountain valleys of western Montana. And this is what I spent a couple of weeks in September going up into some of these, following these valleys up into British Columbia. And there's spectacular evidence. And it's almost like the American geologists stop at the 49th parallel, and they say, well, that's the Canadians preserve up there. We'll let them, they've got their own theories, we've got ours. Interestingly, the Canadians are saying that we think that the water for these floods came from up here. But they don't like that because, you see, one of the leading geologists who's saying that these floods came from Canada is John Shaw, who basically came up with this idea that drumlins, which are these inverted boat hull shaped landforms that are found by hundreds of thousands in regions where glaciers were, that they were formed not by the glaciers grinding over the landscape, but they were actually formed by massive subglacial flows of water. And his critics have all been saying, well, here's the problem. What's the source of your water? Therefore, it wasn't water, it wasn't subglacial floods. It parallels Harlan Bretz's story very closely. Well, here's the thing. Shaw and his colleagues couldn't really come up with a plausible explanation for how you could form these massive subglacial reservoirs. In fact, what they call the Livingstone Lake event required 84,000 cubic kilometers of water. And 84,000 kilometers, I can do it really quickly here. We divide that by 36. That's about 2,300 cubic miles of water. That's more than all of the Great Lakes combined. Vastly bigger than all of the Great Lakes combined. It's probably every lake in North America combined. And he said this one event required over 2,000 cubic miles of water. Well, where did that water come from? So he basically said, well, there must have been a reservoir somehow that formed. His critics have said, that's impossible. You couldn't form that much water under the ice sheet. Well, what's happened now is the idea of a major cosmic impact into the ice sheet has completely obviated the need for a subglacial reservoir, because now we have a way of instantaneously melting enormous volumes of ice.
It's no longer a mystery where the water came from. It's fully explained, and this has been the missing piece of the puzzle until the Comet Research Group began to identify this evidence.
Well, it's baffling to me that this is a source of controversy because we know that the Great Lakes were created by melting glaciers. We also know that there's vast areas of North America that are flattened by these glaciers. You know, a buddy of mine, my friend Doug, lives in Cazenovia, Wisconsin, which is what's called the driftless area, where the glaciers didn't go through.
I just was there in May.
It's beautiful.
Last May. It's beautiful.
It's gorgeous. It's rolling hills, and it's just it wasn't crushed flat like other parts of North America were.
Right.
So we know that those glaciers melted and they created the Great Lakes. I mean, the Great Lakes were from glaciers. We know that.
Right.
That's an established fact. So why is all this confusing? I just don't understand why they wouldn't just add that to it. They're just going to accept the glaciers somehow or another. In the last 10,000 years, the glaciers just decided to stop smashing North America flat and melt and create these great inland oceans of fresh water.
Yeah. No,
Bizarre.
It's very bizarre. Ultimately, a lot of ideology is involved in this. There's this desire, also in the modern world, there's a desire not to panic the public, not to say things that are going to cause panic.
Even with Donald Trump being president, don't you think people are ready now?
I think people are ready for panic. I think so.
Has anybody debated you on this? Either one of you on this?
Well, I tried to, but not specifically on this. I tried to do a debate with Zahi Hawass, who's the guy who runs the Giza pyramids, and
he's a madman.
Total. I mean, very crazy event. But
there's a video of it online.
There's a video.
It's quite hilarious.
There's a video of it online.
The debate lasts 30 seconds?
It's something like that. Yeah. And then later on, when he finally agreed to come back into the room because he was so angry with me, he walked out. When he finally came back into the room, he was asked a question about Göbekli Tepe, and just like your skeptic, he didn't know anything about Göbekli Tepe, or he claimed not to know about it. I mean, this is supposed to be the world's most famous Egyptologist, and he knew nothing about this incredible site in a neighboring country. But one point to make: Randall was talking about the second event, 11,600 years ago. We're dealing with an episode of cataclysm, which begins 12,800 years ago and ends 11,600 years ago. Both episodes accompanied by massive floods. And the 11,600 years ago date, I may have mentioned this last year, it's in Magicians of the Gods. What's interesting about that is the exact date that Plato gives us for the destruction of the lost civilization of Atlantis. Plato, that's the only source we have for Atlantis. It comes to us, many people think it's all over the place, but it's not. Atlantis comes to us from the Greek philosopher Plato, who lived around 340 BC. And he got the story through his family line, from his ancestor Solon, who had visited Egypt in 600 BC. And there Solon was told of a great civilization that had existed on Earth, that was the progenitor civilization of Egypt, but that was destroyed in a terrible cataclysm. And he asked, a cataclysm involving a gigantic flood, and Atlantis was submerged beneath the waves and was never seen again. And so Solon said to the priests, when did this happen? And they said 9,000 years ago. That was in 600 BC, so that's 9,600 BC. That's 11,600 years ago. That's Meltwater Pulse 1b. How could they know?
Come on.
Yeah, how could they know?
We have to start taking this stuff more seriously. Instead of sneering at it and skepticizing it out of existence, we need to leave a little bit of room for extraordinary ideas possibly being right. That's the main beef I have with the skeptics, is that they want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
I want to add something to that. In the Timaeus, Plato discusses Atlantis in two dialogues. And in the Timaeus, he prefaces the story of Atlantis by recounting the myth of Phaeton. Now, the myth of Phaeton is a very interesting story, and basically what it is Phaeton was the offspring of Helios, the sun god, who was raised, didn't know who his father was. His mother kept it a secret from him, and then one day he was being taunted at school because all of his schoolmates had, recounting the great deeds of their fathers and everything. So he went home distraught, and finally his mother said, well, actually, your father is the big granddaddy of them all, Helios, the sun god. So Phaeton decides he's going to go and find his father, and eventually does, and he goes to some, celestial realm where his father is located. And the way it is with the Greek gods, they have unlimited powers, except they also have certain restrictions. For example, if a god makes a promise, he or she cannot go back on it, right? So when Helios sees Phaeton, his lost son, come, he's so overjoyed, he says, I'm so happy to see you, I will grant you any boon you want. And Phaeton says, I want to drive the chariot of the sun. I want to drive your chariot. And Helios says, well, I meant anything you wanted except that, So it goes back and forth and back and forth. Finally, Phaeton convinces his father, let me do it. His father says, look, you've got to hang on to those reins tight because those steeds are going to pull away from you. He gets in there, the gates of the sun open. It describes, in the myth, you can go, you can read Edith Hamilton or Bullfinch or any of the great retellings of the Greek myths, and they'll describe it in there. It goes through the signs of the zodiac, and then all of a sudden it careens off and heads down to Earth. And then it describes this whole litany of catastrophes, just setting the Earth on fire. And finally, the Jupiter at the beseeching of Poseidon, who's afraid that the oceans are going to boil away, gets Zeus to mount his Mount Olympus and hurl his thunderbolt, which knocks Phaeton from the sky, and he falls to earth and falls into the river Eridanus, which is a metaphor for the Milky Way. And his sisters, the Heliades, then weep over the death of their brother, and their tears fall to earth and cause the great flood. Plato then, after referencing that myth, he then says, now this has the form of a myth, but what it really represents is a declination or a declining of the bodies in space orbiting around the Earth, and an eventual falling to Earth of one of those bodies, and a conflagration of all things triggered by the fall of that body.
It's intriguing that he mentions the zodiac, because the Tauride meteor stream is so called because it appears to come at us from the direction of the constellation of Taurus, a zodiacal constellation. That's where those shooting stars, amongst which are some very large objects that have hit us in the past and can hit us again in the future, that's where they come from. They come from that area of the sky.
It's actually an illusion. It appears that they're not actually coming from Taurus.
It looks like that. They come from that area of the sky.
They come from that area of the sky. And so anybody in ancient times who was witnessing, and according to the Victor Klube and William Napier and those guys who are the British neo-catastrophists that have been doing all of this work for decades on the Tauride meteor shower, have concluded that, in times past, it was an extremely active shower and would have created some pretty darn impressive light shows, even if it wasn't causing catastrophes down here below. But what they've conjectured is that there might be times of multiple Tunguska-like impact bombardment when because there could be thousands of objects within the Tauride meteor stream on the same scale as the Tunguska object. And that, if you go and you read the accounts, the eyewitness accounts, over and over again, people are saying things like, well, it looked like it was being disgorged from the sun. It looked like it was being born out of the sun, right? It looked like a second sun in the sky. Like, for a short period of time, the sun had a twin, right? Well, the summertime Taurids are coming from their perihelion passage around the sun.
I don't know how much longer I'm going to be playing this.
Saying,
maybe half an hour, maybe less.
Orbit out to Jupiter and back around the sun in this stream.
Very likely less.
Earth crosses that stream twice each year. One
Maybe
time,
like
late June, early July, we cross, but at that point they're coming from
Wanna
the
load the
direction
vape
of the
again
sun.
though, maybe.
So their
At least
arrival
maybe.
to Earth is going to be very difficult to see because they're coming from the direction of the sun, right? But that's exactly where, on June 30th, a Tauride meteor would be coming from. And then also the fact that it's the perfect date for the peak of the shower and the correct place in the sky, to me, is pretty convincing evidence that it was most likely a remnant of that Tauride stream. The other time that the Earth crosses is late October, early November. In fact, we've just passed out of it within the last week, basically. But it peaks, interestingly, coincidentally, between like October 30th and November 4th or 5th. So it's peaking right around Halloween time. In fact, they've been called the Halloween meteors, and there's some very interesting...
Halloween fireworks, sometimes they call them.
The Halloween fireworks, yeah. But there's some very interesting work done by a researcher back around the early 20th century named Grant Halliburton, who spent about 15 years researching the connections between ancient calendars. And he concluded one thing very interesting was that a lot of these ancient calendars were being synchronized by people's observations of the rise and fall of the Pleiades, which is the shoulder of the bull. The Pleiades comprises basically part of that constellation of the bull.
Taurus,
yeah, the shoulder of the bull. And what he came up with was that in his research, he discovered that many of these stories that were associated with this, like the slaying of the celestial bull, you know, Gilgamesh and Enkidu in the earliest known story, they fight this celestial bull. There's many counterparts and variants of that in mythical stories. And so what he then found out, though, was that in many cases, that our modern Halloween actually goes back thousands of years to an ancient Day of the Dead that was observed all over the Earth at the same time every year, even in the southern hemisphere. And it usually revolved around a commemoration of the culmination of the Pleiades, which is when the Pleiades crosses the local meridian. In other words, it reaches the keystone of the royal arch up in the sky. So if you go out on Halloween now and you face the south in the northern hemisphere, you will see the Pleiades right at midnight. At midnight, they will be, if you think of the arch of the zodiac as being like a clock, it's right there at midnight, right? Well, here's the interesting link, is that in all of these myths, what Halliburton discovered over and over again was that the Day of the Dead ultimately went back to myths of the destruction of the world by a great flood and or fire.
It's fascinating that it's all coming out of the constellation Taurus too, and it's the celestial bull that they're fighting in these ancient myths, and all these cultures around the world are celebrating the Day of the Dead at this exact same time. This is amazing stuff.
And right now our science is closing its eyes to this. I think it's fair to say, with the Taurid meteor stream, which is a very big issue in this whole discussion, that we are dealing with a hidden hand in human history. It's something that is going to ultimately require us to re-explain almost everything. The skeptics hate it. They can't bear it. Because, first of all, it involves cataclysms. And secondly, it involves the possibility of losing a whole civilization from the record. It's really interesting when you look at the dates of this cluster, this episode of bombardment between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. That's the period that just immediately precedes what mainstream academia think of as the very beginnings of civilization. And they've just never, maybe it's not even their fault. This is so recent, this science is so new that they've not had time to adapt to it. But if they adapt to it and take this into account, then suddenly what was an extraordinary and absurd and impossible idea, that there was a lost civilization 12,000 years ago, becomes a very plausible and reasonable idea. And then we start, once we take that on board, then we can start opening our eyes to archaeological anomalies, like the Great Sphinx, like Baalbek, like submerged ruins, like Göbekli Tepe, and begin to consider, what does all this mean? Are we in fact a species with amnesia? Are we here forgetful of the truth about ourselves? Maybe that's why we're so fucked up, because we just actually don't know. We've made up a story about where we came from and what we are.
I certainly think it plays a part, and I also think that conservative skepticism is probably prudent when you're dealing with most scientific issues.
Course.
Most things that come up that people are claiming, I mean, there's so many charlatans out there and crazy people that are claiming new discoveries, but in some cases, they examine these discoveries as long as they're far enough away from us or weird enough, like this new planet that they believe they have a 90+%.
Planet 9,
They're pretty sure there's something outside past the Kuiper Belt, and they think it's massive. They think it's at least 4 times, maybe larger than the United States, or the world.
Than the world, and got an orbit of about 10,000 years.
Yeah.
And that's interesting with comets, because this huge, massive object circulating in the outer solar system through the Kuiper Belt, which is the source of many of the comets that hit the Earth, is destabilizing comets from safe orbits and putting them into really dangerous orbits that come our way.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but what is the source of all these near-Earth objects? Does it have anything to do with Earth 1 and Earth 2? Does it have anything to do with the initial impact that created the moon? Is that because we were hit by another planet, right, during the formation of the Earth? And this is all scientifically established. Astroscientists, or astrophysicists rather, and astronomers all agree on that, right?
There's a lot of debris that would go back to that time. But comets are another story, because they're coming in from the far reaches of outer space. They're coming in from the Oort cloud and the Kuiper Belt, just vast distances away. They're voyagers. They're kind of messengers from the distant reaches of the cosmos who come in an unpredictable way, because their orbits are destabilized by something like Planet 9.
Isn't there something called Bode's law, where you can measure the mass and the orbit of a certain planet, and you can accurately depict where the next planet is going to be? And doesn't that fall apart somewhere between Mars and Jupiter?
With the asteroid belt.
Which would indicate.
Oh my
that
God! I
something
can't
was
believe you
probably
survived.
That's been the theory.
I think I
of the
shot him
asteroid belt.
twice.
It was an exploded planet. Of course, there's a lot of opposition to that theory too. You're right.
Can't believe you
Skepticism
survived.
really has an important role to play. it's really essential that we are skeptical.
Otherwise, we'd all be following Zecharia Sitchin and waiting for the Anunnaki to land.
Exactly.
We would have sold our houses December 21st, 2012, and we'd all be going, what the fuck, now I'm homeless.
Exactly.
4 years later.
And I have to say, there's a skeptic called Michael Heiser who has done really an excellent job of thoroughly, debunking the bogus translations of Zecharia Sitchin.
Yeah, is he SitchinIsWrong.com? Is that him?
SitchinIsWrong.com.
Yeah,
it's a very useful site. So
I hated him and loved him at the same time.
He runs right into the middle of the room so he can
the
shoot
aliens
me.
come down and manipulating the monkeys and making us to mine gold.
Dude,
it's a wonderful
that
story.
was so
But unfortunately,
dumb.
it's a work of science fiction. It's not a work of
so
fact.
dumb, man.
Damn it, Zecharia.
I knew him.
was
He was a
bothering
fascinating
me.
man. I once drove him from Stonehenge to London. We had many conversations. He was a deep and serious researcher, but I think he got carried away with his own fantasy.
I also think that fantasy became very lucrative, and it also became a source of identity to him.
Yeah.
I followed him pretty closely as well. I read The 12th Planet, and I got really into his research, and this is in my early pot smoking days when I first started smoking pot. So I was all in. I was all in.
Yeah.
And then as I got wiser, and then as I got, I don't know, maybe not wiser, just I started recognizing objectively why these things are so attractive. The fantastical is more attractive than the practical. And so
something else. Again, I don't want to put Sitchin down, and I'm here also to say that Sitchin did a lot of really good work. He was a clever guy, and he did a lot of very, very, very thorough research. I've just lost my track, actually, smoking too much dope. Where was I going?
Well, we were talking about the difference between the fantastical and the practical, that there's this inclination to accept things that are fun.
Like so much lie.
That's what I was going to say, is that when you start talking about the Anunnaki, those from heaven to earth came, these fantastic creatures from...
Thank you. You've brought my memory
Planet
back.
Nibiru.
I remembered what I was going to say. What's
Maybe
interesting?
You need some pot. I know Randall wants some.
Could be good. What's interesting is that the level of technology that Zecharia attributes to the Anunnaki / Nephilim, that level of technology is the level of technology that we had in the 1970s when we were, NASA was doing its stuff. So it's NASA technology from the 1970s that is projected out onto. Hand
it over to Graham.
That is projected out onto his theory of the past. Now, it seems to me very unlikely that the Nephilim or the Anunnaki would have had for 400,000 years, which is what he's saying, the same technology that NASA had in the 1970s. It's much more likely that he's projecting that onto the data rather than that it's actually inherent in the data.
There was also some interesting ideas that he had that turned out to be ideas that scientists had also proposed about preserving our atmosphere by levitating or by suspending reflective particles in our atmosphere. And that is something that the Anunnaki in his books were going to use gold for, because gold has such unique properties, which is why they use gold to plate things, because you could take a little tiny piece of gold, you could plate this entire table. Gold is a really spectacular piece of, it's just, there's nothing like it, right?
Absolutely. No, there's a lot of really good material in Sitchin, but unfortunately the translations of the texts, are not translations of the text. They misrepresent the text. Often what he did was he took a 19th century translation and he massaged it so that it would, fit his argument, and that's a pity. So we need skeptics, and they help us to sift out the wheat from the chaff. But occasionally, what the skeptics do with this drive to criticize anything that's not mainstream, occasionally what they do is they let go a really good idea, which deserves investigation and which the human species could benefit from. And that's my feeling, is we're this amazing species, we've developed all this science. Why are we so ready to let go of wonderful ideas?
Well, it's also fascinating to me that because of what Sitchin has been sort of criticized for, people now ignore the stuff that's absolutely undeniable, like the actual stone tablets themselves, the clay tablets, where you can see the depictions of the solar system. Somehow or another, these people from 6,000 plus years ago had a detailed map of the solar system.
They had a clear idea of the solar system.
With the size in like a relatively correct order, in the planets in the right place. Like, they somehow or another knew that Jupiter was bigger than Mars. They knew these things in some weird way, and we don't know why, and we don't know how. Also, the caduceus representing the double helix of the DNA. That's a really fascinating concept too. That the caduceus is used for medicine, and it's used to I mean, it's just he had some really interesting points. Zechariah did. So it's kind of too bad there was so much crazy involved in that.
I think what any of us should do when we're exploring the deep and hidden mysteries of the past is to go to a lot of different sources. Go to a lot of. Don't just stick with the mainstream. Don't just stick with the alternative. But try to bring it all together. And in a way, that's what I try to do in my books. Except the skeptics still hate them.
Yeah, but it's so hard because it's so fun to go with the crazy story.
Yeah,
like the alien story is so compelling. It's so fun.
Very compelling story.
I mean, if we found some sort of evidence of aliens, it would be so utterly spectacular. Even if it was a simple alien. Like I've always said this, that if we found like a jellyfish on the moon, we would freak out. But, you know, there's really complex, bizarre things at the bottom of our ocean that we've never discovered. They're just not in the correct location for us to be excited.
And then the other issue, we're getting slightly off our flood topic here.
That's okay.
But the other issue of entities, the encounters with entities, anybody who's smoked DMT will know that, as I have, as you have, that will know that you do encounter entities in the DMT state, and they do communicate with us. And there's a lot of parallels with the ETs, or the aliens as they're described in modern UFO abduction accounts. And Rick Strassman, have you ever had him on your show?
You know, Rick got sick. He was supposed to be here a couple of times. We're trying to reschedule it now.
Yeah.
But he had some pretty serious health issues.
I know.
And we had a date scheduled out, but I love that guy. I've had a chance to sit down with him a couple of times and talk to him.
And of course, you presented DMT this week.
Yeah, he's brilliant. And he's so important to me because I remember when I did it, I was so confused. I mean, to me, it was like my first DMT experience changed everything I thought about the world. And I immediately didn't give a shit about aliens anymore.
Right.
Like it was almost instantaneous. Like before then I was like, Roswell, they got the ship, man. Yeah. It's in a hangar. But what I encountered doing DMT was so spectacularly alien that the pedestrian concept of something that looks like a person but has a bigger head and large eyes.
And higher tech.
Yeah. It was as weird and cool as it would be if it was real. It was nothing. I mean, literally not 1/1,000,000th as interesting as what you absolutely can encounter when you do DMT. Like, that's the aliens.
That's the aliens, an utterly alien realm filled with alien intelligences who communicate. And of course, again, the skeptics say, oh, it's all just made up in your brain. But we don't know that. And Rick is open to the possibility that we are dealing with areas of reality that are not normally accessible to our senses, and that become accessible to our senses by retuning the receiver wavelength of the brain, which is what he suggests DMT does. And I think that's very plausible. And at the very least, those who are interested in UFOs and aliens should be also investigating this line of inquiry. Can we use changes in consciousness to understand the majestic complexity of the universe in which we live? And I think the answer is definitely yes. And many of Rick's volunteers, I paraphrase, but they came back with reports that the entities who'd encountered them said, we are so glad you've discovered this technology. Now we can communicate with you much more easily. You know, it's fascinating. So there's a technology for encountering other intelligences. And against that, this mechanistic, simplistic alien meme that's going around now that they're a bit like us, but they came here in higher tech, it's dull by comparison with that.
It is dull by comparison. If you're interested in anybody, the book is amazing. It's called DMT, the Spirit Molecule. And he has a new book that he's putting out about...
DMT and the Spirit and the Solar Prophecy.
Yeah. And he's just a really, really interesting guy. But
his experiments
that he did were the first, I think, in many, many decades to get approved by the government.
Correct.
So he did everything above ground. He was above board.
He did, and because it was government approved, his remit was that he had to find some therapeutic benefit for DMT, and he couldn't actually. But that's not the point. I'm sure actually there are therapeutic benefits, but that's not the point. The point is, here is a tool for investigating the mystery of consciousness and the mysterious nature of reality. And I mean, fuck me, if we get 5 or 6 volunteers who haven't compared notes, all coming back who've met entities who said, we're so happy you found this technology. It's hard to explain that as just to reduce it to brain activity.
Not only that, when we talk about things that are so big and are ignored by mainstream culture, this is one that's just like that. You're talking about an endogenous human chemical that not only is in us, but is it in thousands of different plants? Like, I mean, how many different plants contain DMT?
Huge number.
Huge number.
Very prosaic ones like peas and, you know.
Well, there's the amazing
like
story.
Acacia.
That's what I was going to say.
The
There's
Australian national tree is actually illegal.
Isn't that? But the Jerusalem, the professors from the University of Jerusalem, I believe.
Benny Shannon.
Yeah, where they were talking about, they believe that that's what the story of the burning bush in Moses is.
So that is mimosa with the DMT and Syrian rue with the monoamine oxidase inhibitor. In other words, it's ayahuasca, but a Middle Eastern alternative of it, doing the same thing molecularly.
And isn't it possible in some way that the idea of the burning bush was them figuring out how to dry or extract DMT and burn it?
Very likely.
Very possibly, right? Because they're talking about the burning bush producing God.
Yeah.
And it just so happens that this bush is, the acacia tree is incredibly common and super rich in DMT, and it's all over the area.
Yeah.
And I should probably insert at this point that if you're at all familiar with the Masonic ritual, you'll know that the acacia plant plays a central role.
That's right. You're one of them 1% Mason characters.
Every now and
You're
then,
one of those insiders.
every now and then on Facebook, Randall, I get accused of being a Freemason. Hancock is a Freemason. As though it explains everything. I know lots of Freemasons. I've spoken in Masonic lodges, but I'm an author and I shouldn't belong to clubs, you know.
I went to a wedding that my friend Duncan Trussell was performing at for these two Satanists in like 2003, and to this day, it was one of the LeVays, Anton LeVay or Stanton LeVay, whatever is his son. And his son got married. This was some young hedonist, you know, and they call themselves Satanists. And so Duncan performed at this wedding, and I went there. To this day, I get fucking tweets about being a Satanist. So I can't join your little club, pal. I can't be one of your Masons.
I need to confess here, Graham.
Yes.
You didn't realize this, but I secretly initiated you.
Oh my God.
Oh, you're in. How do you get in? How do you secretly initiate somebody? Can you do that for real?
No.
Oh, okay. Scared me.
I sort of did.
Sort of? Well, you could get him in if you wanted to, though, right? If you know the people.
Oh, of course. Even you, Joe.
I don't think so. It's not happening, bro. I met a couple of Masons. They're very cool.
Well, most Masons don't really understand the corpus of symbolism that they're sitting on top of. I got to say that. Not to get off on the Freemasons, but simply there's a mass of symbolism. And that's the whole, that's the thing that they're custodians of. And most of them don't have a clue what it means. But they're doing an important job by preserving this corpus of symbolism through the layout of the lodge, the meaning of every component in the lodge, because it's a purely astronomical allegory. And then you have the Masonic carpets, and that's where you have the whole story of the comet, the flood. It's all there. The acacia plant, it's all there.
It's all, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's all also an integral part of how Washington, D.C. was designed. Is that true?
Yeah, to some extent. I honestly haven't studied that too much.
What I've seen is that there's a bunch of videos where you could watch it where they sort of describe how the layout, is in some way some sort of sacred geometry. I think what it's based on.
Freemasons were massively involved in the construction of Washington, as they were of many great cities. The city I live in, England, has got major Masonic architecture.
So is it like people like me, like my initial prejudice? I hear something like the Masons, like, oh, fucking dude's in a cult, get out of here, leave me alone. Like we assume that all groups of people that follow anything somehow or another are wacky.
Masons, in my opinion, they're largely a drinking club for men. Mainly, that's what it is.
Guys who let women in at all?
But you can make special arrangements to bring women into a lodge. For example, my wife's, when I've given a talk in a lodge, I've given talks in 2 or 3 lodges, been asked to do so, then they make a special ceremony to allow my wife Santa to come in, because I won't go anywhere without Santa.
I see.
And so women can go in, but then there are others within Masonry who are pursuing deeply esoteric interests and exploring the mysteries, and you can have incredible conversations. In fact, so it's just another group of people who are doing their thing. It's not for me. I wouldn't join. I would lose. I think if I joined Freemasonry, it would weaken me as an author. I think I'm better able to comment on these things by not being a member of any such group.
That's interesting. Why do you think that?
Well, because I think I have to remain open to all possibilities, and if I commit myself to a particular line, I don't commit myself to a particular religion. I don't commit myself to a particular men's club either. Which is what Masonry is. I think if I commit that, then ultimately I would become a spokesperson for that, and I don't want to be that.
That makes a lot of sense considering your occupation and how important being open-minded has been to your life.
It's vital. It's absolutely.
Without it, how could you have ever done fingerprints of the gods?
I could not.
You would have to. I mean, and the initial thing where you were telling me about Ethiopia, that place where they believe that the Ark of the Covenant lays, which is one of the most bizarre ideas ever. Mm-hmm. And
that was my first book on a historical mystery, was The Sign and the Seal.
Yeah, to try, and when you go into it, like, it's so interesting. But I've always imagined you as a young guy forced to sort of reconcile with this bizarre piece of evidence. You've got these old men that have cataracts in their eyes, like they're around radiation sites, and no one's allowed to go inside and see this thing, and they claim they have the Ark of the Covenant in there, and like, what the fuck is in there? You know, like,
it was the beginning of a of a magical journey for me.
It's been a magical journey for all your fans too. For guys like me, man. When I read Fingerprints of the Gods, it was, to me, it was one of those books I just couldn't put down, and it was so mind-blowing. And this, again, was in the heart of my fucking aliens, man.
Fingerprints was published in 1995, and Magicians came out in 2015. And I would say in that time, the evidence, when I made the case for a lost civilization and a global cataclysm in Fingerprints of the Gods, I can't begin to account for the amount of hostility and anger and rage that I generated in the academic community. And the idea was considered to be absolutely absurd. 20 years later, with Magicians of the Gods, it's not so absurd anymore. The evidence is mounting. We have incredible evidence now for a global cataclysm in exactly the period that counts, between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. And we have sites like Göbekli Tepe, we have a redefinition of the Sphinx. The whole area is just about to explode in the future. We're on the edge, I believe, of a paradigm shift, and this comic material is central to it.
What I really appreciate about your courage is that you've also had the courage to admit when you've made mistakes. Yeah. You don't in any way pretend to be some sort of bearer of secret knowledge that no one else possesses.
And absolutely not a guru. I don't want to be anything like that. I'm a reporter. That's right. What I am, and I'm a reporter who's reporting on offbeat subjects, and to some extent I'm an outsider. So one of the talks I do now is about being an outsider. I think there is a place for outsiders in society.
Well, I don't think you're an outsider. I think you're an outsider from the established mainstream ideas. I just think that
Me and Randall are the same. We're both outsiders in that area and working in different fields to get into this.
But don't you think that these established channels that were so deeply grooved in distributing information, those things have widened so wide now, where you're getting, a professor could do a podcast. Like, he could teach a class and he could write a book. Or he can do a podcast on a certain subject. And, like, you're aware of Dan Carlin and that Hardcore History podcast, which I just can't stop raving about. But what he's done is brought historical, accurate, but really dramatic stories of real events that took place to millions. Like, that's just, that no one's doing that. Like, this is, but it's not mainstream. Well, what's more mainstream than being #1 on the iTunes podcast list, which he is all the time? What is more mainstream than he must be getting millions of downloads?
It's part of the big change that's taking place in our society, that the old structures are being overthrown. They're being thrown away. It's a very uncomfortable time. It's a very uncertain time. It's a very exciting time. Right. Because we can build out of this something amazing in the future. The internet's had a huge part to play in it, the fact that people can communicate with one another all around the world.
Well, since I've had a web presence in the last, I was a late comer, but maybe 2 to 3 years ago, I've been getting contacted by, professionals from around the world. I've got probably a dozen major ones. Geologists who want to know more about. And interestingly, you said earlier about debating.
Don't tease me, game.
Looking for somebody to debate.
Don't tease me.
I because I have questions, and I'm thinking maybe somebody who would disagree with me on something could still help me answer some of those questions. Right. But I try to associate as much as possible and hang out with professionals in the field. And of course, what I discover is that a lot of them are working in these things part-time, almost clandestinely, without making it part of their, if I go on a field trip with geologists into the floodlands, none of them are really working on it full-time. It's all part-time. They're working for the government, they're working for the oil companies, or, exploration, mineral exploration, whatever. They're doing this research into geological catastrophes on their own time.
Right.
But recently, just last summer, I got invited to actually present some of my research to the Atlanta Geological Society, which is the largest society of professional geologists in the Southeast. So I jumped at the chance rather than you know. And so I presented hoping that I would get challenged, that somebody would say, wait a second, there's a flaw in your thinking here. Didn't happen.
So did you make friends with some of these mainstream geologists?
Oh yeah, well I mean I've been known, I mean when I just took a trip for, in September, spent 10 days back out in the floodlands, and I had a geologist with me on that trip. So yeah, I'm getting to know more and more people who are working as, well, you know, I majored in geology in college, so I still am in touch regularly with the head of the geology department. I see her pretty much on a regular basis and have been keeping her apprised.
I didn't do, there was no A.
She has offered
A
to
didn't
sponsor me
complete.
at whatever point I think that I can pull it together as a dissertation. But we'll see how that goes. I mean, my objective was to learn geology, not to become a professional geologist. I wasn't interested in working for the government or working for, you know, the energy industry. I had geological questions, and that's why I majored in geology.
And you've walked the walk, and in my opinion, you know more about this stuff than 10 fully PhD geologists.
Yeah, you always freak me out. So what's fascinating to me about all of this is that I think what you've done has been very measured. You know, everything you back up with facts and photographs and descriptions and disclaimers. You know, when you say, well, it is possible, you will go down other various paths. You're not dogmatic about these ideas, but you've spent so much time going over this. I don't know if there's a commensurate guy in mainstream archaeology that has been public about it the way you have been. Because if there is, I feel like we probably would have heard about him. Your podcasts have been, the ones that we've done, they've been seen by millions of people. They've been listened to by millions of people. I mean, the information's getting out there. And
it's making a real difference.
You're always going to have the guys like, I think Michael Shermer's very important. I'm not criticizing him. But that knee-jerk reaction to do something, to mock something or put down something that's not mainstream. Like one of his tweets, he said, you know what archaeology with evidence is? And he wrote archaeology. Like, why would you even tweet that?
Yes.
That doesn't even make any sense. Like, that's someone who's not paying attention to your work.
That means that
all you do is focus on evidence.
I'm reminded of the Shakespearean line, methinks the lady doth protest too much. Why does he need to say that it's got the evidence, you know? It's like,
why is he tweeting
it's like
at
Fox
you?
News saying fair and balanced, you know?
He's tweeting at you with this.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, your entire book is based on photographic evidence.
Yeah.
And all the other various pieces of evidence. I mean, your
Facts,
whole thing
documents,
is... It's all
research.
about examining all these pieces of evidence.
Yeah.
These aren't things that you've invented.
No.
These are actual real sites that you can look at.
I'm drawing inferences from them that they
Yeah.
don't like. That's the thing.
Well, Robert Schoch and guys like him are so important.
Yeah.
Guys who have the courage, who's a Boston University professor
Absolutely.
who has the courage to look at the stones and say, this is the product of water erosion.
Kudos to Robert Schoch as a geologist, as a career academic geologist who's taken that risk and put himself out there and followed the evidence where it leads. Another one is Danny Hillman Natawajaya in Indonesia, who's been responsible for the investigation of this extraordinary site at Gunung Padang, where work has been stopped since 2014. Again, he's a highly credentialed geologist. He's Indonesia's leading expert in megathrust earthquakes, but he's been looking at archaeology, bringing his geological expertise to that. So things are changing. We are finding academics who are willing to engage and willing to discuss. I got into a very interesting email correspondence with a guy called Daniel Lohmann at Baalbek, from the German Archaeological Institute, who's an architect and an archaeologist, and he was very civil with me, and he answered my questions. We went into it in depth. We had quite a long debate. That's very refreshing. That kind of thing wasn't happening 20 years ago.
Yeah, that is very refreshing. Now, what about those pyramids in Bosnia? Has that been, what is the deal with that? Are those things?
I've been there. I know Sam Osmanagic personally. Sam is the guy who's promoted the site. I like Sam very much. I must say, when I'm in his aura, I'm extremely convinced. But when I look rationally at the so-called pyramids, I don't think they're pyramids. I think they're hills. With Sam showing me around, I did spend 3 days in Bosnia looking at the so-called Pyramid of the Sun, the Pyramid of the Moon, the Love Pyramid, and so on and so forth. I do see that a tourist industry has built up around this, and it's a fabulously beautiful, intriguing site, and a massive, beautiful, mountainous place, but they are hills. They are not pyramids. Impression is given that there are tunnels, passageways inside the pyramids. That's not true. The passageways are about 2.5 kilometers away. They're very low tech. I just don't see it, and for that reason, I did not cover the Bosnian pyramids in Magicians of the Gods. I'm not going to say they're not pyramids. I'm not going to write a book saying that they're wrong, but they didn't excite me enough to justify devoting a chapter to them. There's much more exciting and important archaeological discoveries that are being made, like Göbekli Tepe, which need more space.
And there's some pyramid-like structures or hills in China as well, right?
There's thousands of pyramids in China. Xi'an, the province of Xi'an, is just the moment you land there of your aircraft, you're seeing pyramids everywhere. I've been there. There are certainly hundreds and hundreds of them, distributed across fields, vanishing off into the distance in all directions. They've been terraced and used as agriculture. The local farmers grow crops on them. I went there with Chinese archaeologists. They haven't excavated a single one, not one.
Why not?
They said, we don't have, this was nearly 10 years ago I was there, they said they probably got the money now, but they said then they didn't have the money. They said, we're an old country, we don't mind if we wait 200 years to get to grips with this.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah. And the famous tomb of the first emperor is part of this pattern. It is also a pyramid, it has also not been excavated. The terracotta army around it has been found.
The terracotta army is amazing.
Oh yeah.
That was on display somewhere, wasn't it? Where you can go and see it live?
Yeah, they did some kind of travel.
I'd want to see that thing. I'd want to look at those things. What a bizarre concept. Now, these pyramids, so this one that this emperor was buried in that had the terracotta army, was that a pyramid as well?
It is a pyramid.
It is.
Absolutely. It's a man-made pyramid. The terracotta army was buried around its edges, not in the pyramid itself.
So the army was there to protect him?
Yeah, to protect his soul into the afterlife seems to have been the idea. And then there's a mythology that's come down that within the pyramid is a lake of mercury, that there are mechanical devices in there which will fire arrows at you if you go in. That there's a whole story about how intensely protected it is, and up to this day it's not been excavated.
That's so crazy. How could someone leave that alone?
And you know, even major archaeological sites like Tiwanaku in Bolivia, for example, you'll find that only about 2% of the site has been excavated. I don't know how we can draw inferences about the whole site from a tiny little fraction like that, and that's the problem, I think, with archaeology, and it's why we have to, consider another way.
We're looking at an image of the terracotta army now in front of this pyramid, and it is spectacular. Now that I think about it, I don't think that was on display anywhere. I think maybe they had a couple of them.
They brought some of them. They came to the British Museum. There were a number of museums.
But it's so much bigger than I thought it was.
Yeah.
How many? There's thousands.
Yeah.
There's thousands of these terracotta figures.
Absolutely.
And this pyramid was made out of what? Was it stone?
Ramped earth, mainly.
Okay. So they just sort of shaped the ground. They just dug around it.
Yeah, they brought in earth and turned it into a pyramidal mound.
But it wasn't.
It's not massive stone blocks. It's not massive stone. That's why they can grow crops on the sides of some of these pyramids.
Wow, how weird.
Yeah.
So they would build these giant mounds of dirt and then dig holes in them and support them. And
well, they probably created the interior, subterranean as they were building the whole thing over it. Yeah.
And they just stacked dirt on top of it.
Yeah.
Wow, what a weird way to make a house.
Yeah, and then we have to consider this with archaeological sites all around the world, is that any site may actually not be the product of just one culture, but may have been reworked and worked over and used by many different cultures over many different periods.
Stunning to me. I found out about this because of a friend of John Anthony West who was here with him. He showed me, he lives in China, and he was showing me some video of it. And I was like, how do I not know about this? I had no idea there was this many of them. Oh, so here's one that's exposed. What's this?
Controversial ancient pyramids of China.
That one looks exposed.
Yeah.
It's
and that one
stone.
looks blocky. Yeah.
Well, that is another thing about China that we just don't have a clue. When we think about the age and scale of things, we're so silly. We've only been around since 1776 is when the country was established. It's not really that long ago. You're dealing with China. You're dealing with literally thousands of years of civilization, all rising and falling and taking place and adapting and growing, all in this one area. That's still, in our eyes, in a lot of ways, it's kind of behind, right? I mean, they're behind environmentally. They're behind when it comes to human rights.
Consider this. The Portuguese, in the late 1400s, have rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and they've entered the Indian Ocean in their little ships. They've entered the Indian Ocean, and they actually establish a huge empire. They go to Malacca. They go all over the place, okay? The seas are open to them. If they had come 40 years earlier, they would have encountered the Chinese treasure ships. Ships that were 50 times larger than the little caravels that the Portuguese were sailing in. Vastly, you know what the Chinese did at that time? They went through a period where they felt they just wanted to give gifts to people. And they put together these huge fleets carrying incredibly precious gifts, silks and ceramics, and they took them all around the Indian Ocean and they just gave them to people. Wow. So off the coast of East Africa and in East Africa you can find remains of this pottery from this episode. And then a Chinese emperor came along and he closed the doors, burned all the boats, shut everything down, and didn't let anybody speak to China for 200 years.
Whoa, what a dick.
Well, he felt that it was time for the Chinese culture to turn inward.
Yeah.
And they were afraid that their ancient culture, on one hand, there might have been maybe a laudable motive in that they were concerned that the ancient culture was going to get contaminated by too much contact with degenerate cultures from other places, and that was a factor in it.
That constant desire to maintain the current situation.
It's human. We have to say it's some kind of human nature.
Yeah, for sure.
I'd love to see some of these images of
let's look at
the drone stuff from the Camas Prairie and what else.
Let's please.
And let's have a look at it. You got that
I want to get that.
Those Chinese pyramids are still blowing my mind.
They blow my mind as well.
I just can't believe they haven't been excavated.
It's an eerie, spooky scene. I mean, I recommend anybody to go to Xi'an and just it's incredible how many of them there are. And how unexplained it all is. And it's again, it feeds into my general point: is we don't remember our past.
What are we looking at here?
Okay, let's. Can we pause so I can talk about what we're looking at?
Yeah, you look at this one. That way you can hit the mic right in front of you.
Okay, this is the beginning. Okay, here's what we're looking at.
Get that mic right up to you there.
We're looking at a place in western Montana called Camas Prairie, and you see some hills in the foreground, and you see a basin in the background, right? Okay. Right here on top of this hill and down on the side here, you see that there are some quarrying operations. Those are quarrying gravel, because everything you're looking at here, this whole landscape between the hills, are these large masses of gravel, trillions of tons of gravel. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to start sweeping around as the video plays, and you're going to notice down here a series of ripples.
Oh, okay, I see that.
Okay, and I'm going to have Jamie pause in a second, but let's keep coming around. You start seeing the ripples on the landscape. Let's pause right there. Right there, let's pause. Now, I wish I had a pointer, but if you look up, you're going to see a flat piece of land like a tongue coming out, rounded. Yeah, Jamie's right here. That's
to get you a laser.
That's a delta. That's a delta. You know what a delta is? You ever heard of a delta? It's when a river comes into a body of water and it's carrying sediment. And because the river is moving along swiftly, it's carrying the sediment, but when it comes into the standing body of water, it slows down and it drops its sediment. It builds a delta. The whole city of Portland, for example, is built on a giant delta, right? New Orleans is built on a delta, right? Okay, so what we're seeing there is a delta. And then in front of it, we're seeing rippled landscape. Let's keep coming around, Jamie. And so
rippled landscape that looks exactly like the beach looks.
Yeah, keep coming around with that.
That's the thing, it's fractal, because this is the whole mystery of this, that this happens at a scale of inches on beaches and a scale of hundreds of feet here.
Stop again.
Good Lord.
Now, right here in the middle, you see a massive delta.
Yes.
Spewed out like a big tongue, splayed out. And then right down here, you start seeing the ripples. And there's a farmhouse. You see the farmhouse there? Now, those ripples are, the tallest ones are about the height of a 5-story building.
Whoa. How bizarre.
Let's keep swinging around
Let's
here.
just stop this for a second,
Okay.
if you don't mind.
No, I don't mind.
So these things, they're the size of a 5-story building. What is that, like 70 feet or something like that? 50 feet?
50
okay.
feet.
So those are 50 feet high. And how much water?
We'll get to that. Let's see the rest of it.
And these are just dirt, right?
They're well. If you dig into one, what you're going to find is they're a massive. Okay, let's pause again.
Whoa.
Look at this.
This is crazy.
This is totally crazy. This is one of the craziest things you'll ever see.
These ripples, repeated ripples in an area where there's nothing else like it.
This is the fingerprints of the flood. That's what it is.
Wow. Where can someone look at this? How does someone look at this?
In real?
This right now, this is what we're looking at. This is this video.
Well, my colleague Brad Young did this with his drone, and I think he's got it on the website, Geocosmic Rex.
Is this being played in the YouTube video right now? Okay. All right. So the YouTube people are cool with it. If you're listening on iTunes, find it, man. Find it on YouTube. But it's worth looking at. Is what my point. This is mind-blowing shit.
And I think you made the crucial point, Joe, which is that we can understand what this is because we can see it on any beach. We can see how water flows receding across a sandy medium will produce ripples. But here, they're on this unbelievable scale where they're hundreds of feet long and 50 feet high, where they dwarf houses, and they're lying all across. And what that tells us is that a huge water flow went across this plain and did this.
Seeing it from this perspective above, which is a rare perspective unless you're in a plane or a helicopter or something, you get a chance to look at it this way, you really get a better sense of what it is. If you were on the ground there, you'd probably say, oh, look at all the hills.
It's hard to see.
You don't quite get the impression. Now, we did visit this location, and to that day it was overcast, so you don't quite get the effect like you do when a low sun angle. Really helps you to see what's going on in the landscape.
Can I ask you, is there a dispute to this? Is there a,
No, nobody disputes it.
Nobody disputes this is from a flood?
Not anymore.
Wow.
No. In fact, it was this JT party.
Let's be clear. Nobody disputes that it was caused by massive water flows.
Exactly.
Okay. But those same people would still not buy into the notion that there was this one humongous flood.
Okay, so they think it's an accumulative effect, but that this was all created by
This was the
water.
bottom of Lake Missoula, right?
Yes. And this is supposed to actually represent the draining of Lake Missoula.
Right.
Whereas I argue from a number of different reasons that this is the filling of Lake Missoula.
I have a friend of mine who, his friend lives in Montana, and they found a dinosaur on his ranch.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, like really recently.
That's a nice thing to find.
We should come back to that because there's a connection here.
Yeah, the Great Western Inland Sea, all that area. This was a crazy place at one point in time.
Yeah.
Still is, arguably.
Yeah. In a different way.
The water here, Joe, that did this, the way to visualize this is to, again, begin to think a tsunami. You have to think tsunami because tsunami is the closest scale of water flow that we've experienced in modern times. No river flood has even approached this.
Right.
You know, no flood in any floodplain.
Nothing that we can put into perspective.
Right. The closest we can get to it is a tsunami. But even there, you got to picture the tsunamis that we've experienced in the last decade and a half, in Indonesia and Japan. When they made landfall, those tsunamis were roughly between 20 and 50 feet, depending on where you were relative to the oncoming wave and how far distant you were from it. Here, what you have to visualize is a tsunami sweeping over the land that's over 1,000 feet deep. That's what happened here. And we know that because we can trace the high water marks on the hillsides are clearly left. The high water marks are clearly etched into the hillsides. So we now know, based upon the study of the ripples, and the water here was moving down. It's filling this basin. It's rushing in a great tsunami from the north of fresh water, meltwater, coming off the ice sheet. And it's sweeping down over this land at probably 200 or 300 million cubic feet per second, which is an inconceivable amount of water. It's many times in excess of every river flowing on Earth flowing today all at once. It's beyond that many times, 10 or 20 times beyond that.
One of the trippier things about water is that water in itself is kind of fractal in some sort of a weird way. When you look at the actual molecules of water, it's almost like we don't distinguish it as being a fractal thing because we see it as like this moving flow. But if you're looking at the actual molecules of water, a cup of water that you dip your fingers in, which is seemingly completely innocuous, becomes this massive element of change when the volume is 1,000 feet high and it's just rolling over with massive amounts of weight behind it. It's that same stuff.
Massive amounts of weight. Enough
Very
weight
bizarre.
that it's actually causing seismic responses.
I can only imagine.
Yeah,
I mean, how much
is.
weight are you talking about that can create these 50-foot high walls? But what's fascinating to me is that we don't have we don't have a scale like in our minds as a reference, like the difference between that little cup and these gigantic waves that you see that surfers travel by jet ski to get to, off of, I believe it's Mexico.
Right.
You ever seen those massive waves? They go way out, miles out to get to these crazy waves, and we ride them in. They're like 60, 70 feet high. Like that's the comparison, almost like a glass of
No,
water.
we got about
to
15
those
minutes of
waves.
playing.
And then that to this.
It scales
That's
up,
all
it
I can
scales
do.
up, it scales
I
up,
can't
and at
play
a certain
anymore.
point it can change the
I got
whole
about
story
15
of
more minutes.
civilization.
Almost doesn't compute.
I was
Like,
painful
you
that
can
one run. It wasn't that
intellectualize it, but it's
fast, though.
almost
It
not
wasn't fast
computing.
enough.
One of
It
these
was
flood
fast
flows
enough, but
here
it wasn't
is 3
like.
orders of magnitude greater.
I should have
than
went
the
for no body
largest
armor.
Measured
I think that's where I messed it up.
In other words, over
I
1,000
hesitated
times
to
greater.
go for the no
In
body
terms
armor
of
at the
peak
last second. I
discharge
changed my
or
mind.
volume, you
Should've
would
just
have to
done it.
scale up at least 1,000 times
Did you shoot
greater
the other
than any
console, right?
modern measured flood to get to the smallest, really, of these flows here. Because this is just one place, one locale on 5
Chicken
states
note.
where you can trace literally an ocean of fresh water
But you never know,
sweeping
like,
across the entire
You
Pacific
can pass away
Northwest,
so fast in this level.
pretty much washing away anything that was there.
It's almost like we have a defense mechanism built in where we ignore how vulnerable we really are. Like we put it, maybe that's one of the reasons why people are so reluctant to really go deep into studying asteroidal impacts,
I think it
or
is.
or even to pay attention to this stuff. Like that this could happen.
And this is, I mean, those are not two
Yeah.
separate subjects, because this is the result of the comet impact on the ice cap. This is why I feel that the research
Stop.
in this field is so vital.
Okay, right there. Yeah. Now here, notice.
This is crazy. That's a beach.
Oh, yeah, but it's a beach. It's a beach for giant monsters.
Yeah.
Is what it is. You can see in this here that you've actually got 3 massive currents converging here. Do you see that over here on the
Yeah.
right? You've got a massive current coming in that would be from the west, and then we would be standing looking down current. Of course, the drone I'm guessing here is about 200 feet in elevation. So the top of the water was another 800 to 900 feet above this perspective right here. And it's moving very, very fast. And it's sweeping down into a river valley that's down in those mountains you see in the distance. And from there, it's being carried down and joining up other equally as large floods coming in from other valleys. And all of this is happening at once, and it's covering 5 states, basically. And that's just one region that's being affected by this sudden catastrophic melting of the ice sheets.
We are dealing with the largest flood that ever occurred on Earth. It's as simple as
Yeah.
that.
This is insane. I mean, it's insane to look at.
And
Is
it
the
happened here
largest?
in North America, and it happened 12,800 years ago, and its story has yet to be fully told.
Isn't it possible that there was something larger before, like the 65 million year ago one that hit the Yucatan? Like what kind of an impact did that have?
Well, it actually would, because if that
Different
had
kind of
happened
impact, right?
12,000 years ago, we wouldn't be having
None of
our
us would be
meeting
here.
today.
Yeah, that would be a wrap, right?
Yeah, that was
Right.
a single large
That would
object
have been
about
a
6 miles wide. That was a much more devastating impact than the impacts of 12,800 years ago. But nevertheless, those impacts of 12,800 years ago were really, really bad, and they
Yeah.
did stuff like this. And anything that was in the way of these massive flows of water, would have been rubbed completely from the story.
Why?
I mean, this
here-
all
here-
makes sense.
Yeah, and here's the thing that the Michael Shermers don't get. When you understand the extent of this, the scale of this phenomena, and the severity, the inconceivable severity of this, in the aftermath of an event like this, what would remain of a city, a village,
A refrigerator.
no,
Yeah.
not a goddamn thing.
Not
nothing.
much.
Nothing.
Not much.
Nothing would exist in the
Not-
aftermath of this.
And most things wouldn't exist. I mean, you find like an old refrigerator or a car up on blocks in someone's backyard in the South, and it's like the 1970s, and the rot has gotten into
Yeah.
the frame. The
Nature's going to eat it up.
yeah, nature's eating it up just in a couple of decades.
Right.
What's it going to be like in a couple thousand years? It's
We
going to be
should
non-existent.
not be surprised about how little we really know about our past. This is also a comfort game with archaeology. Oh yeah, we've got the past all worked out. We understand it. Here it
Right.
is. This is what we teach in schools. This is what our friends in the media report. This is the fact. It's not the facts. We know nothing. There's been so much lost, so many missing pieces of the puzzle that we're desperately trying to stitch together. And it's important, I think, that we actually do get some clarity on events like this, because we still live on this planet and we have kids and we have a future, and we want to
hopefully
not
if one of those big boys comes our way.
Well, that's right. But again, I come down to this, which is that we are not dealing with gloom and doom and the end of the world. We're dealing with a problem that humanity should be confronting. We should not be sticking our heads in the sand. We should be confronting this problem. And that's why I support the work of the Comet Research Group, because they are the only people right now who are confronting this problem and really getting to grips with it.
We should all confront. I mean, we should absolutely all support them and confront it, because if something like this can happen once, what really makes sense is how many stories of floods there are in ancient times, and how many parallels there are.
And how many there are from North America.
Oh, dozens and dozens. Yeah, it was the the Indian artist who spent 30 years or so pre-Civil War, I think maybe a decade after the Civil War, painting Indians of different tribes. And he wrote a book called Last Rambles Among the North American Indians. Very, very interesting book. But what really is interesting to me when I read the book years and years ago was his final conclusion to the book. He says, after all of these different customs and traditions that have been handed down amongst these tribes, they all have one thing in common. They all have a memory or a story of a gigantic world-destroying flood. And this has included tribes down into Central America that he visited.
I believe the Americas are the repository, the Native American peoples who have been subjected to so much destruction over the years. They, in their mythology, their traditions, their memories, they keep more of this than almost anybody else. It's really tragic what has happened in the Americas from the time of the Spanish conquest. The deliberate destruction of knowledge, the terrible, horrendous abuses that Native American people suffered. They are our wisdom keepers. They are the people who passed down the oral tradition and remembered the past. So not only do we have cataclysms wiping the human memory, but we ourselves actively get involved in the human memory and wipe it. We rub it out. The burning of the Maya codices by the Spanish friars, thousands and thousands. God knows what was in those documents. Yeah. You know, we might have had a whole other story about ourselves if we could have had access to those, but instead we're this destructive, cannibalistic species that just goes and smashes everything to bits.
It's a weird impulse that human beings have, is when they move into an area and they take over it, one of the things they like to do is destroy their icons.
Destroy everything.
What's going on with ISIS and all these ancient Buddhist structures, these 1,000-plus-year-old beautiful sculptures.
Absolutely.
And they're blowing them up,
yeah.
and yelling praise God while they're doing it. It's really very bizarre. It's a very bizarre inclination that we have, but it's almost like we don't want people to know. You know, it's a bizarre, almost human instinct to wipe out the past and just to constantly keep moving forward.
Or is there some trauma? Is there some collective trauma, some deeply suppressed memory
Could be,
that we can't quite confront?
That's exactly the thought I had, because I think that's the one of those areas where Velikovsky finally really nailed it was.
Okay, now I have 5 more minutes, I think.
That somehow we carry the trauma, because once you begin to get a handle and you get the picture of these events as they occurred and did occur and would have been experienced by our ancestors, you've got to understand, what would it be like to see your entire world completely obliterated, starting over again from basically a barren mud field? You know, that's essentially what these people were faced with.
If they lived at all, and so few
obviously
probably
they did, because here we are. But, you know, again, the evidence is emerging of major cultural collapse.
If you had a guess, what percentage of the population of human beings, just as obviously just a guess, but how many do you think were wiped out? Half of them? 3/4 of them?
I don't think that would be unrealistic. No.
It doesn't seem like it would be. And if it was that number, and those people, that's enough for people to survive. And if it was that number, boy, what a strange, fucking mythical past they would have.
The other thing to bear in mind is, in the world today, our world, we have an advanced civilization. America, you know, Germany, the industrialized technological countries. And we have coexisting with them in South America, in the Namibian desert, we have hunter-gatherers. So the notion that hunter-gatherers and an advanced civilization might coexist in the same epoch of history should not be strange to us, because we're doing that today. And that's what I would suggest happened before 12,800 years ago, before the cataclysm of 12,800 years ago, that there was a fairly advanced civilization that was capable of mapping and exploring the world creating gigantic works of architecture, and it coexisted with hunter-gatherers. And who were the ones who survived the cataclysm? The answer is the ones who survived the cataclysm were the hunter-gatherers, not the sophisticated peoples. A few of them survived, and they then settled amongst the hunter-gatherers and tried to transfer some of their knowledge and skills to them. And it's the same today. If we were to have a repeat of the Younger Dryas cataclysm today, I don't think that people from Los Angeles or London would be amongst the leading survivors.
Right.
I think the survivors would be people like the hunter-gatherers of the Amazon rainforest, because they're in the business of surviving. That's what they do. It's not a mystery to them. It's not even a problem. They do it all the time. They would carry the human story forward. And 10,000 years from now, their descendants would be telling a myth about how there was once a great civilization on this planet, so advanced that they could even go to the moon. They could fly around the planet. They could speak to one another on other sides of the earth. But they did something wrong. They fell out of harmony with the universe. They ceased to wear their prosperity with moderation. That's actually a line from Plato about Atlantis.
Wow.
And the universe slapped them down. So there would be a differential survival rate. I would say that those who are more technologically advanced are less likely to survive, because they depend on a complex interrelated network of skills. And any individual on his or her own, most of them, well, you're different, Joe, because you do know how to survive, but a lot of people don't know how to survive.
I barely know how to survive. I'd most likely
but at least you've worked at it, you know.
Yeah, but I'm not that good at it.
But most of us haven't even worked at it at all. We haven't got a clue.
Let me fucking open everybody's eyes to all these people that think that you could just go out there and shoot animals and stay alive. Good fucking luck. You're probably screwed if you have a rifle. Even if you have a rifle, you're probably screwed. If you have a bow and arrow, you're gonna fucking starve to death.
Right.
It's extremely difficult.
Yes.
To get close. You know.
And yet hunter-gatherers for thousands and thousands of years have succeeded in doing that, like the Bushmen of the Kalahari.
But I think there was less humans and more animals.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I think that's also part of the rub.
Okay.
It's like we're dealing with just one of the terrible things we've done is taking these giant swaths of land and made them entirely inhabitable for wildlife, like cities. Like how many people grow food in the city? What is the percentage? Is it even 1/10 of 1% of people in the city grow their own food?
Probably not.
It's probably not even that. So you have these massive, essentially deserts where no wildlife exists other than predatory species like coyotes and ravens and things like that. And then you go out from there, and then you have these vast farmlands.
Yeah.
The only benefit of the vast farmlands is the amount of deer that exist now is greatly more than when Columbus landed. But it's because they've almost become an agricultural animal. It's almost like they're almost a domesticated animal. They're a free, wild, domesticated animal. Like I have a friend who has a farm in Iowa, and when you go there, it's very strange because he's got these wild, giant 300-pound forest horses running around his backyard. I mean, they're fucking everywhere.
Right.
There's all these giant deer, and when we were there, it's what's called the rut. So all these, they're very horny. So the big bucks who usually hide, they show themselves. I'm like, this is a crazy place. Like there's
one
all
more
these
glass
wild animals that exist along with people.
I think,
and
and
even
then I'm
in
gonna
a
sign off.
game
One more
rich
glass
place like
attempt.
that, it's incredibly difficult to get to one. And you have to have vegetables. You'd have to have your own vegetables.
So let's imagine a situation where all the resources of our cities, all the
gonna
amenities, all the infrastructure are gone.
Most of us are fucked.
I would say radically,
Actually, this might be the
I would
last
say in
one
fact
right here.
our civilization, which appears so
Yeah,
strong,
this is
is
the last
actually
one.
very, very fragile.
Extremely.
Just a little push.
It's
is
like
the
when
last
you look
one.
out the window and you're like, wow, that's the outside.
Thanks for
No,
being
that's
here.
a piece of glass.
Really appreciate
You're outside.
the run.
It's
Yeah,
not
really.
that piece of glass and you're
you
outside. You know,
imagine?
the effortless it is, it just seems impenetrable because you
I
don't pull the shades
fucking
tight.
did
you
shoot him.
set your alarm
So,
clock, you
okay.
sleep. You're sleeping next to
What you saw there, I
glass.
think twice in a
Like,
row,
it's
the
hilarious. You
lag.
feel confident.
I
You're
think
sleeping next to a
ate-
piece of fucking glass.
Now, there's this
I don't know, I
incredible
might have shot his
complacency
gun,
and
but it
and
doesn't
arrogance
matter.
Yeah.
This
of
game
modern
sucks. I don't
civilization,
want to
that
do
we
this
are the
anymore.
apex and pinnacle of the human story, that we're the best that's ever come, and
This might have been the
that's a
angle, because I
danger-
might have been on the ground,
mythologically,
and he might
that
have
is
been
a
on the
very
higher
dangerous
step. I
place
saw
to
him
be.
shooting with the gun
when you
or
start
something.
imagining yourself as the apex and the
Oh,
pinnacle of everything, that's
God.
precisely
The
when the universe
auto-aim.
reminds you that you are not that at all.
Yeah, it's a very weird existence that we have where we just sort of
I can't do
look
it
at
anymore,
how
not
things are
tonight.
right now, and we
That's okay though, we
can't
had a really good
imagine things
session.
being any different. No matter what, whether it's people that have to come to the realization that they've been
bad on
injured,
the eve of
someone
a
breaks their leg, and all of a sudden it just
Mercury
doesn't compute. Like,
retrograde.
how come I can't walk anymore? Well, your reality is
So
now
we get that
shifted.
new moon,
And this
PV
reality that
tomorrow.
we have here with this fairly healthy Earth could shift at any moment.
Man, we had one really good
Yellowstone
run tonight
volcano
that
is
we
the one that's been freaking me out the
fucked up.
most over the last few years.
Another big
Whatever.
issue.
Yeah.
Thanks for
An interesting parallel would be if we look at smaller, what happens in smaller catastrophes, like we've seen today. When we look at the, for example, when Katrina hit New Orleans, right? It was almost as if the human species separated into two subspecies.
Thanks, bro.
You had one group of people that rose to the
Good
occasion,
company, good friendship, good
did
memories,
heroic things.
good times.
They organized and they saved people spontaneously, you know, because the government was conspicuously absent for 5 days, the first 5 days of the Katrina disaster. And here you had a major flooding of New Orleans, and you had people spontaneously organizing and performing these heroic actions of saving their fellow man and doing just stupendous things, superhero type things. But then you had another segment of the population that just went completely barbaric, and you had mass rapes and smashing of businesses and looting and just people running in wild, complete, unrestrained gangs, just committing violent acts at random. So.
And America, the richest country on earth, did not manage that crisis well.
No.
I mean, it was very, and that
Not
was
at
a
all.
little crisis by comparison with what we're talking about.
You remember when Kanye West got on TV? George Bush does not like black people.
Oh, I don't remember that, but yeah, George Bush, I think it was on day 4, George Bush flew over an Air Force One and looked
Good
out
move.
the window.
Wave.
Yeah.
Give people hope.
But there's a lessons in those kinds of events.
Sure. Yeah, we're
Because
not prepared.
we have to extrapolate from that. And if you go back, I oftentimes as a thought exercise think how would we respond if we knew that there was a high probability of a younger Dryas type event or series of events impending in our future?
What would you do? Start drinking, or
Well,
what can
it
you
depends.
do?
It all depends on lead time.
Right.
It all depends on lead time.
What if it's a 10-day lead time? Like you're not going to be able to shoot a rocket up there.
Listen, man, fire up that Duber again, and let's
Exactly.
Go hard to the end.
Yeah.
10 days. But 10 years or 20 years,
Then we can do some stuff.
then we can do some stuff.
The real scary thing is there's two scary things. One, if you survived, because you're like, fuck. If you really did survive and everybody else was jacked, and all of a sudden you're dealing with some Mad Max type reality where people are starving to death and they're very desperate and they become almost like animals. That's entirely inside the realm of possibility.
Well, that's what we learned from Katrina.
Or the other terrifying possibility is that you leave the future of civilization up to those other people. Is that they survive and they have kids and their kids survive, and somehow or another, somewhere along the line, we get better and better at understanding our place here, which is what I think has happened.
Yeah.
And all it would take is one. I mean, this is as much as people are complaining right now, as much as there's riots in the streets protests in the street, some riots apparently, but over the president-elect. What this time is, it represents the greatest time in history when it comes to safety, when it comes to knowledge, access to information, the way we understand each other. I don't think it's ever been better, as far as long as we know.
We have everything at our feet.
Yeah.
There's incredible potential in modern civilization. But the problem is that there's also very rigid mind control. The way that our societies work is it's turning people into drones.